That's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Quiet on the side.
America, we stand for freedom. Though freedom is never really free, we yearn and strive for government, protecting our liberty.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Your Right to Know, brought to you by the Fitchburg Republican City Committee. I'll be your co-host this evening. My name is Andrew Couture, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Mary Lotze. And our guest this evening is Dr. John Strang, from the chairman of the Fitchburg Republican City Committee. And tonight we're going to be talking about socialism. What is it, and why has it become so popular among Democrats and the 2020 Democratic candidates for president? So, starting off, John, can you please introduce yourself and tell our audience a bit about your educational background and why your background lends to discussing socialism?
Okay, I'm a doctor of philosophy from Boston University. I attended Boston University, got the doctorate in 1984, and I have master's from University of Kentucky. I attended Albert Ludwigs Universität in Freiburg and Breisgau, Germany. And my degrees are in all cases in philosophy. Marx, of course, who was the foundation of socialism in the practical political sense, was a philosopher of sorts, so it's an obvious connection there. Mm-hmm. I've taught philosophy at various New England institutions. I'm retired now, but still available.
Excellent. So we hear so much about socialism as a better form of government. Many Democrats today brag that socialism is more responsible to the fulfillment of the needs of all the people. Can you explain the term socialism, both as a term and as a form of government?
Socialism, actually there are various forms of socialism. In the 19th century in particular, there were religious types of socialism, but the significant form of socialism is Marxism. Karl Marx, the 19th century philosopher, dedicated his life to his brand of socialism, to achieving a socialist society, a society in which the state governs the means of production and determines various aspects of welfare will be allocated to the populations. This at least is the assertion of socialism. It hasn't worked out so well. There are degrees of socialism, and indeed in communist societies like the former Soviet Union, they claimed not yet to be a fully socialist state, but to be working toward it. We can perhaps talk later about differences in present forms of socialism, European socialism, for example, versus, say, the type in Venezuela or Cuba and so on.
Okay, yeah. So as we set the stage for our discussion on socialism, I think it's worthy to take a few minutes and get another definition in front of our viewers. In the United States, we're a republic. And our founders, when writing the Constitution, specifically designated the United States to be a republic. And can you define and explain the difference in a democracy, a republic, for our viewers, and then try to explain how socialism differs from a republic?
Good. Yes, indeed. The Founding Fathers were keenly aware of the difference between a sheer democracy versus republic, with a small r. They studied ancient history, and ancient Greek history in particular gives examples of ancient city-states that were true democracies. That is to say, these were all direct democracies, and those who were the majority ruled. And typically, when they got power in these ancient city-states, they would outlaw other political factions or reduce their significance. The Founding Fathers were aware of that, and they didn't want anything like that. So they sought for a scheme of a government whereby certain aspects would be democratic, but it would be a republic in the sense that we were not a sheer democracy. In a sheer democracy, there would be the tendency for majority will to dictate in all circumstances. This, incidentally, is something we see in the gripe of many Democrats in our present time. They don't like the idea of the Electoral College. But of course, the Electoral College was put into the Constitution precisely in order to forestall the possible rule of a sheer democracy. So it's a mechanism for governing in the interests both of the people who are holding power and those who seek to hold power, so that minorities' rights are guaranteed as well as the majorities.
So for going to the Electoral College, some of our viewers might not be aware of what exactly the Electoral College is, but it's a system designed so the smaller states have almost an equal say in the vote, rather than California,
Right.
New York, dictating who will be the next president.
Right. If we did not have the Electoral College, if we indeed operated on the basis of, candidates go to the states with the largest population, they would do just that. They would ignore these smaller states and smaller populations. And that would effectively undermine part of the goal of the Founding Fathers in establishing our form of government. We don't want that. I don't think most Americans want that. Yes, that would happen. Yeah.
And
You asked me about another aspect of your question was how it differs from socialism.
Yes,
You want me to deal
yes.
with that now? Or?
Yes,
Sure.
please.
Well, socialism, the pretensions of socialism, that is Marxism, are that the only form of government that can guarantee welfare and the necessities of life to the population is a socialistic form of government. And this implies that the state would manage the economy. It would determine who gets what. Ultimately, it would be the power behind any decisions of an economic nature. And it's not just economic; it's also at social levels. Just as an illustration, in socialist societies, people tend not to be aware of this who haven't lived in socialist societies, but the state rules everything. We do not have the possibility of diverse points of view, of organizations like churches, for example, forming aid societies or giving charity and so on. Did you know that in the Soviet Union, charity was against the law? It was against the law in the Soviet Union for individuals to do acts of charity. Because why? Because that conflicted with the pretension of the state that the state should be the agent behind all of these actions. So the thesis is that in a socialist society, and by the way, socialists are a bit fuzzy in how they frame this, in that they're not always clear about who is the actual agent here. You'll often hear those in favor of socialists saying, we want the people to control things, society to control things. Practically speaking, that means the state.
Right.
They won't say that, but that's what it means. And typically when this happens, because the state is the central power behind everything, it means that there's no incentive to check into what's going on. When things go wrong, you cannot find the responsible party. It's all shared out among committees and so on. People who advocate socialism, I had students who would do this in my classes, would often say that, well, yeah, you can manage things like the environment better, if you have a central administration and so on. And I said to him, why don't you actually look at the history of how the Soviet Union managed the environment? There's a major lake in the former Soviet Union, Lake Baikal, that's been almost destroyed because of environmental pollution. Chernobyl, of course, is another example. Yeah. The Soviet Union routinely dumped nuclear wastes in the Arctic oceans. It's still there. there's instance across the Soviet Union, Russia across a vast territory in which this has taken place. This is the routine way in which socialist states deal with problems, because they control.
They
can do it, and they do it. And there's no counterbalance. There's no media out there that's giving a free, a fair presentation of what's going on. So there are many collateral problems with it.
Well, just as you were talking, because I was going to ask you, so what is it that socialism would do for us? But a couple of the things that you just commented on, diverse points of view, our country is moving to where we're no longer allowing diverse points of view. Look at our college campuses. You cannot differ in views. People are shutting you down or
outright attacking you.
Attacking physically. I mean, you can't wear a MAGA hat. Or you would be not served in a restaurant or escorted out or something. So a lot of the things that just in what you were saying, my question is, so what will socialism do for us if we were to move into this form of government? And it's frightening, so please explain a little bit. What is socialism supposed to do?
Well, the pretensions I indicated are that the state is a better provider for all the needs of the population. That's the claim. And of course, Marx had a pseudo-scientific way of supporting this claim, claiming that this is what history exhibits, that all previous societies were oppressive with an exploiting class in charge, and when you eliminate that class and replace it by a state operating in the interest of the masses, all those problems will disappear. That's the claim. The history is very different. It's never worked that way. No socialist societies, whether you're talking about the hard forms of totalitarian socialism like that in the Soviet Union or in China, or relatively soft forms of socialism, there are always problems. In the harder forms, well, the problems are so significant that they resulted in the downfall of the Soviet Union and its various satellite socialist states in Eastern and Central Europe. In the softer versions, and this is an area of confusion which young people in particular exhibit, but not they alone, the assumption is, well, you have the Scandinavian form of socialism, for example, in Sweden and Denmark and so on. Well, it turns out on examination it's not quite as socialist as it seems. Swedish socialism, and Danish too, allows much greater sway for capitalist individuals and for capitalism than would ever be permitted in a surely socialist society. The whole, and actually this is kind of apt, something just happened recently that sort of indicates why socialism's become such an appealing moniker for young people today.
That's what I was going to ask about that. Why the shift?
Well, there was recently a meeting in Chicago over the July 4th weekend called Socialism 2019, a meeting of various socialist groups in which they were talking about what united them. And what was significant from my perspective, because I'm a philosopher by training, is how little philosophical there were. This indeed I found in other occasions. Most of these young people who go into socialist groups don't know Marx and don't have the intellectual stamina to understand Marx. But they are appealed to by emotions. By the emotion, for example, that it's unfair for certain people in society not to have as much as other people in society. It's the sense of unfairness. So the pitch is one of equality, and the assertion is, well, socialist societies provide greater equality than non-socialist societies, which is also bunk. But let me just quote a little bit from a report of some of these people at this meeting in Chicago. The conference had the tagline, "No borders, no bosses, no binaries." Binaries, by the way, is referring to traditional gender designations. Okay. The walls of the various conference rooms were adorned with posters of Karl Marx and various depictions of socialist thinkers and causes. The theme throughout was identity politics. That was the major theme. It wasn't so much discussing Karl Marx, even though his picture was plastered everywhere. The panelists and attendees were radical and often expressed contempt for the Democratic Party establishment. But it was nonetheless clear that from the actual discussions that they blended traditional Marxist thought with the agenda of what is now the mainstream left in our country. They did so by weaving their views about identity politics, which now dominate college campuses,
yes.
as you're aware, and the media and popular entertainment. And both of these areas, of course, of our culture are heavily left-leaning. So the culture war was being used as a launching point for socialist ideas. The part of their claim was that they embraced what they called democratic socialism, and they wanted to distinguish it from the hard forms of socialism that I alluded to, like North Korea, for example. We're not like that. Or Venezuela. They even distanced themselves from Venezuela. All this is new, because just a few years ago, most of these leftists were great enthusiasts for Maduro and his predecessor. Sweden is usually cited as their guide for what socialism is in practice, or should be. But in fact, when it came to actually discussing policies, they did go hardline. They were in favor, for example, of the state taking over things. They wanted, for example, state-based health care, free health care, so-called free health care for all. Well, you can't have free health care and have at the same time a system of individual life insurance, health insurance, and so on. So that's an indication that they're inconsistent in where they're coming from.
Well, there are many people who talk about different things that we've had taken or put into place in the United States. Social Security, Medicare. I mean, there's a number of programs that we have implemented through the years.
Right.
And they say, well, see, we're already socialist.
Right.
We're already we're already moving towards socialism. And that's a way of saying, well, we're not become all these things that we want more free stuff.
Right, right.
So
they're claiming this is part of our tradition already, our history already.
Right.
And we just want to extend it.
Right.
Here again, they don't know the history. How did social welfare actually enter into the United States? Where did it come from? The idea, for example, of Social Security didn't come from any socialist country. It came from Prussia. Bismarck instituted it in Germany in the late 19th century, by the way, taking the wind out of the sails of his socialist opponents. Of course, he's the one who stipulated that we should retire, working people should retire at age 65. Now, cynics said that he did this because most people at that time didn't live to be 65. But that's true, there weren't many, but still it was the only country in the world at that time that did institute anything like Social Security. And it proved its worth. We adopted it in our period of crisis during our Depression and so on. So it's true that elements of what seemed to be a socialist agenda have been adopted by the United States. In the opinion of many, too many of these elements have been. When Social Security was first adopted, the opponents of it, for example, said it will get the average citizen into thinking that he's automatically entitled to retirement from the government, even though he pays in something that will never be enough, it won't be a higher enough fraction.
it was never supposed to be.
It was never supposed to be, but most people now assume it is.
Right.
So there's a sort of a creeping attitude. So I don't deny that there are elements of what are seen as a socialist agenda that we've adopted, but we haven't done so at the expense of our freedom, which in our system means also our freedom to make our own way in life, our capitalist freedom.
Well, do you think some of this, and this conference that was in Chicago 2019, socialism, do you think part of it is, what is the root why so many people now think socialism is the way to go? Are we lacking in education?
Yes.
When we were young, we were touted that our freedom gave us our ability to achieve whatever we wanted to achieve in life. We could be anything because we were free people. Now it seems like that's not true.
And in addition to that, I mean, when you guys were younger, and I remember, back in the 80s, there was the socialist scare. The Russians were going to bomb us. And there was fear there, and it seems like that fear has basically been replaced.
Almost evaporated.
Yeah, to almost being welcomed.
Right.
The
What happened?
certainly you named the word education. That's a critical element here. It's not the only element, but it's true enough that our educational system has become corrupted by socialism, by socialist thinking.
By socialist thinking.
And it hasn't come because the people who go to teach in our high schools or colleges know Karl Marx in any significant way. Most of the people who wind up becoming sympathetic to socialism on college campuses get their sympathy from sociology, not from philosophy. Sociology as a
Soft science, maybe.
well, yeah, it's of all of the faculties represented in a college campus, probably sociology is among the weakest, along with education. Students who major in education and in sociology tend to have the least intellectual aptitude, and their teachers also tend to be extremely narrowly focused. They're concerned about critical issues. They too respond to emotional issues. They're not concerned about the foundations, the philosophical foundations that led to these enormous claims on the part of this philosophy.
Well, maybe we could call them the emotion science.
Well, it is.
Sciences, because that's how they're almost,
Right.
Socialism talks about so much about the woes of some
Right.
people, why they get there, and instead of trying to correct or change those underpinnings, the answer now seems to be, well, we want to make them equal, so we just free stuff.
Right. By the way, another factor in why young people in particular seem to be more sympathetic to socialism is they don't have any sense of obligation to the country. I mean, there is no military draft anymore. This was wiped out in the 1970s, as we know. It's fairly well known that men and women who have served, actually had military service, tend to be much more receptive to the original Founding Fathers' message.
Because they're fighting for something.
That's
they're
right.
fighting for liberty,
and they actually
understand liberty.
have the life experience of realizing what goes into making a functioning Republican form of government. This is absent for young people. Many young people, particularly young men I found in my classes, tend to be lost. They didn't know why they were there. They didn't know what they were doing. They were very susceptible to the appeal of drugs and, of course, sex, which is
Sex,
a major
drugs, and
fact.
rock and roll.
Right, all of that. And this made them less knowledgeable about the way our government works, our country works. They didn't have a vested interest in it. They seem to be, in many cases, lost. Now, another thing that's going on is, and this I'm drawing on what this conference was talking about, is that most of the members who attended this Socialism 2019 conference in Chicago were in favor of open borders. And you might not think that, or it may not even be obvious, that there's a connection between being a Marxist socialist and being in favor of open borders. But you have to recall that the pitch of the socialists before the First World War in Europe was that there should not be any fighting among the various powers in Europe, among the people in Europe, the Germans against the French and so on, because they were all laborers, they were all workers, and they should have that common interest. Well, this is still operative. It's gone through some transmogrification, but it's still the prevailing sentiment. The pitch of these people at this conference was that, well, you have capital flowing across borders, why shouldn't you have labor flowing across borders? What do borders mean, after all? See, from their point of view, borders, national sovereignty is an impediment to achieving the socialist dream. And of course, the individuals who favor this policy of open borders, of essentially denying our national sovereignty, they too are being appealed to by emotion, because they see these pictures of, deserving people from Central America, and no doubt there are many deserving people from Central America seeking to come in.
Right. The emotion again.
Right. Yeah.
Now, who was it that said that you can't have a welfare state and open borders?
Gee, I don't remember. I don't remember that.
But I think that statement rings pretty clear, is that you can't give free stuff out to just any. Eventually, Margaret Thatcher, you're going to run out of other people's money.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's the premise of socialism, is eventually you are going to run out of money.
And the premise of it's sort of the cornerstone of the 2020 candidates and the Democratic ticket, because they're all trying to out-free stuff each other. I mean, it's almost like one will say, well, I want free health care for all, and then the next one will, well, I'll up you in that,
Right.
and now I want free health care
free college,
free college,
free that.
So, I mean, how do you stop this? What is the need? Do you educate people? How do you stop this snowball that's going faster and faster down the hill?
Historically, republics with a small r survive if the citizenship is aware of the implications of their policies, and to the extent the citizenship is aware of them.
But it sounds so good. Boy, I would love to send kids to... Andrew, you're a young father with 2 children that you know at some point you want to send to wonderful universities.
Yep.
Free college.
Right. It sounds good.
It sounds good.
But again, reiterating what I said, historically, republics survive to the extent their citizenship is aware of the policies and the implications of those policies. What we have now is a nebulous sense of citizenship, with many young people, as I sort of intimated, not really significantly aware of what is involved in being a citizen, because they don't perform any military service, for one thing, which incidentally was the first stage of citizenship in the ancient Greek republics. They had stage citizenship, and at age 18, the first stage was you went into the army for two or 3 years. But there's that connection is missing. When they get to school, both at the level of high school and then in college, they get propagandizing by ill-educated teachers who don't really know the significant detriments associated with socialism, the history of it. It hasn't worked, as I've said, it hasn't worked anywhere. It hasn't worked anywhere. Its claims have been expanded beyond the actual historical record. Socialized medicine in Britain doesn't fully work. It doesn't work absolutely in Canada. Otherwise, you wouldn't have Canadians coming here for medical care that they can't obtain there. Because you have to stand in line for various apparatuses.
Jagger happened to come to New York for his heart valve replacement.
Right, and there are many cases like this. But a major part of the reason why there is this sympathy for socialism, and it's, by the way, I don't think it's as significant as we think it is, but it's still significant, is that the young people and older people don't really have experience in dealing with it.
Well, when you said older people, Bernie Sanders is a socialist. Now, he was adopted by the Democratic Party when he ran in 2016, but he is a true socialist. I mean, this is self-proclaimed.
What do you say about a guy who took his honeymoon to the Soviet Union?
Right.
You know, right there. And this, of course, right there, that would have laughed him out of the contention a few years ago.
Right.
But the citizenship seems to be, vastly ignorant of things like this. Socialism doesn't work in soft socialist states, and it certainly hasn't worked in the hard totalitarian variants. But if you have a citizenry who is ignorant of history, ill-educated, and not receptive to the requirements of citizenship, they become more and more appealed to by these claims. To some extent, as I indicated, they're simply not aware of the implications of what they favor.
Now, John, we're coming to the end of the show, but I do want to get one of the last questions that I really want. If socialism is such an impressive form of government, what happened in Venezuela? It was a self-sustaining, wealthy nation with national resources, but in just 2 decades, people were eating their dogs. I mean, what happened?
Well, it's an illustration of what happens when the state takes over, becomes the sole decider who's going to get what. In a capitalist form of government, you have competition among various contenders for providing services and goods. That's eliminated in the case of a socialist state. Venezuela, of course, it was operating because it had such enormous petroleum reserves. Amazingly, it seems to have gone down the tubes. It doesn't even have enough petroleum for its own people. It's rather amazing.
Exactly.
Well, unfortunately, I think that's going to end our show for this evening. I want to thank you Doctor, to coming on the show, and this has been a very interesting subject. I think we could probably...
It's frightening to think of what could happen in an election and why elections really do matter.
Correct, yeah.
We thank you for watching Your Right to Know tonight and sitting in here with the FRCC. We want you to remember that your local or city or town Republican Committee is your only grassroots organization that supports and holds dear your liberty, your constitutional rights, and your conservative values. We believe that the GOP stands for growth, opportunity, and prosperity for all people, and we always stand for freedom. Thank you and good night.
America, we stand for freedom. So let us all unite to yearn and strive for our republic that reflects our values, that preserves our rights, and goes forth in power and might, that reflects our values and preserves our rights, and goes forth in power and might.